Uh, Sorry to interrupt. This is Mr. Ford. I just got a text from Mr. Buxton. He said he's
Streaming is
just
on.
finishing the call and should be joining us shortly.
Streaming is on.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ford.
Wow.
Streaming is on.
Hey, it's JB. I just joined. Sorry, I was late on another call.
Welcome,
Thank
welcome.
you. Lawrence, are we good to go?
Yes. Yep, you're good to go. Streaming is on.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. This is Andrew Seiberg, and my colleague Kim Evans here. We also have Tom Tomberlin lurking in the weeds. This is a subcommittee meeting of the Pepsi Commission. And what we've done here is we've tried to include some board members from the State Board of Education. We've invited Mr. Buxton, Mr. Ford, and Dr. Oxendine. I think at least two of them are here already. The goal here is to try and work out how we might proceed to incorporate in some capacity diversity into the weighted composite model proposal. And again, just to level set for everybody who's might be new to this process, essentially 107, House Bill 107 stated in there that they have accountability measures already in place, but they are interested, the lawmakers are interested in a weighted composite model, which they've assigned to Pepsi and ultimately the board to come up with their take. At the point at which the board approves it, then it would go over to the lawmakers to consider modifying law to change from the three measures that are already in place to potentially whatever weighted composite model is developed. And this subcommittee is doing a lot of the work behind the scenes to do a lot of the critical thinking on that, ultimately to push up to the broader Pepsi commission, and then ultimately to go to the board with their best recommendation, consider for approval. So given that, I want to invite Tom into the discussion here. Tom and I have been working behind the scenes with our colleague Mike Cash to come up with some alternative, a possible alternative way to navigate the issue of diversity. I thought maybe by sort of walking you through it, it might stimulate some conversation here. So what you see in front of you is a document called Race, Gender by Institution, version 8. And also that was, hopefully you all have a copy of that as well. So I have a screenshot of it here, and I can sort of navigate that as we're going through. But you can also sort of navigate at your own pace as well. So one of the things, and I'll invite Tom to jump in organically as he sees fit, but one of the things that we were thinking about here was, is there some way that we could look at the institution diversity as sort of a way of looking at how to shape expectations of the EPP. So, and this came from conversations that we've had over the past year in this subcommittee about how to, what's the best way to handle this. So Tom, and I put our heads together, and this document is sort of doing just that. So at the very top left here, you'll see we're basing this off of 2018 data, and that's because the most reliable institution level data that we could gather from NCICU, which is the Independent Colleges and Universities, about the institution level demographics was 2018. And then we talked with Tiffany Watts over at GA, and she was able to give us the publics for 2018 and 2019. And so we just made a judgment call to use 2018 because it was common across both of those organizations. And then what you're seeing here at the very top is the institution across row 1. And then you'll see the diversity of the institution in rows 2 through 11. We've also calculated percent male in this process. Then when we get down into row 28, you'll see EPP demographics, which is the educator preparation program within the broader institution, and the numbers based on demographics associated with the EPP. And then as we go further down here, I mean, we just converted them into percentages and so on and so forth. But essentially what we've done here is we've looked at, and when you get down to row 58, you'll see the institution minus the EPP. So we're looking at the, when we look at the institution and we look at the EPP, what are the differences associated with, or how representative is the EPP relative to the institutions in terms of each of these subgroups. And then when you get to 71, you'll see, and here I might want to draw Tom in. Are you accessible, Tom? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm here. You're doing great.
Okay. This at row 71, we've taken the EPP total and multiplied that by the institution percentage. So in other words, we've tried to figure out on row 71, we said, well, let me give you an actual example. If we come up here to, I think it's 44, isn't it, Tom? What we're saying here is that the number of folks in the EPP that are non-white, and we're looking at this calculation at 71 would be if the institution were to be in the same percentage of non-white candidates, they would need, in this case in column B, they would need a total of 49. And in that, and that is obviously more than what they currently have. And how many more is 73, row 73. So we're seeing here, if we look at ideally, if they were representative of what the entire institution had, which would be 49, they need a total of 29 to get there. And then Tom and I's thinking here is one way that we could look at this is we could consider, I think everybody here is in agreement that you're not going to turn around issues of diversity overnight. So it would be ludicrous to say, okay, so now suddenly you need to be the same as your institution. Let's look at what it would take to get folks to be in alignment with the institution over a period of 10 years. And so we took 73 there, row 73, and we divided that by 10 and rounded to the closest. And essentially, ASU would need to grow effectively 3 non-white candidates in their EPP every year for the next 10 years in order to meet the same diversity demographic proportions that their institution has. So let me just stop there for a second because that was me fumbling around trying to explain that. And let me invite 2 thoughts. One is, Tom, would you like to weigh in and say it better than I did? Or to anybody else that's listening, do you have any questions about how I got to where I got so far?
So I think you did fine. I think row 71, just to clarify, is the total EPP population multiplied by the institute percentage of non-white. So that yields the number of non-white candidates the EPP would need to reflect the proportion of non-white candidates in the institution. But I think the rest of it was fine.
Okay. So does anybody have any questions about that so far? So
This is JB, just a quick clarifying question. So
Sure.
the baseline, one of the baseline assumptions is we want to recognize the character of the institution that people would be recruited to, and that some institutions will have a tougher time diversifying because of their historic population or their, is that,
Sort of, Mr. Buxton. The way the argument back and forth over this issue over the past 6 months or so has been, it's very difficult for the EPP to recruit outside of their institution because they're actually recruiting candidates in their freshman and sophomore years. It's not like they're going out to recruit folks in K-12. That they are limited in some capacity. They are limited to the demographics of the institution by which they are affixed to. And so what we were trying to achieve here was to say, okay, well, let's look at the demographics that are limited to your institution as a means by which you can move the needle. Does that answer your question?
yeah, that's helpful. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And so it does mean that when you're looking at each of these, their respective needs to grow, or have they already met or exceeded, may be subject that they're going to be wildly different, right? So essentially, an historically Black university is going to have a lot different demographics than an institution in Western Carolina, for example. You know, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just taking the fact that each of these institutions, their specific demographics into consideration as a more specific way of looking at things.
So Andrew, do we reset each year? So if you take UNCW's case, we're 51 over 37. So do we come back in each subsequent annual period and reset? Or do we set this number in year one of a 10-year cycle?
Right. So let me let Tom weigh in on that, because we actually discussed this, and the short answer is I believe that we would want to set this and leave it for a while as opposed to changing it every year. Tom, can you weigh in on that?
Yeah, so Dr. Dempsey, that's a great point. In a moving target is kind of harder to hit. So we would recommend using either these data or 2019 data to establish a benchmark. The other thing within that, if we did this and held it constant and said, here's your expectation of attainment towards the goal for every year, then it's going to be tricky enough holding it constant, because with that 29, so your measure of 29 is, you've got to maintain the 20 that are there, or that 20 doesn't get counted in your progress towards the goal. So that keeps the 20 constant. It's adding above and beyond that. So next year, let's say for ASU here, they got their 3. So the expectation would be that they would have 23 in place, and they would need 3 more, or 26. So we feel like it is going to be, it's not, I have to get 3 a year and who cares what happens to the other ones that were already counted. You've got to maintain that within your enrollment in any given year, that expectation. Does that make sense?
Yes, you have to have a cumulative effect over time.
Yeah, and so I think
Exactly.
that piece of it would suggest that we wouldn't want to recalculate it every year.
Gotcha.
But we're happy to discuss that. I mean, that's something for this group to decide and recommend.
This is Ann. I have a question. This is Ann Bullock. So different EPPs, the School of Education is different population percentages within that organization or IHE, right? So at Elon, the School of Ed represents 5% of the entire population of undergraduates. So statistically, how is that accounted for in this model?
So this is Tom. Can you help me with why the smaller percentage would not necessarily need to reflect the overall percentage of the institution?
I guess I'm asking it more as a question. So I don't want to use me as an example. So if you are a larger institution and a larger percentage of student body is, and maybe this isn't even a rational thought. It's just something I think about. Like if I have 5% of this whole student body to recruit, 5% more, it's going to be more difficult for someone who has a smaller margin of the student body than someone who has a larger percentage overall. I know it's based on the total population, but I'm just wondering I guess maybe my question, Tom, is do you think it has a statistical effect? Maybe that's my real question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't necessarily.
I can't decide if it does or not.
Right. It's so that in that case, so let's think about that. And you've got an institution, let's just make it this easy. You've got an institution of 100 people.
Right.
And 5% of them are non-white. In your institution, you have 5 candidates within that. That would mean your ultimate goal would probably be to recruit over the 10-year period would be to recruit. If you recruited one minority, you would meet the goal at such time as you recruited that one person. So it seems to me like it would be
even out.
It would equal out across the different sizes, and it really may be a slight advantage to smaller institutions that if they can work really hard and get one, they may meet that goal.
Right. Okay. It's just something I was thinking about in terms of, since we're recruiting, this model is to recruit within your population, which is what we have control over, but we don't, the different institutions, public and private, the school and colleges of education are different sizes, which I know are reflected in these numbers, but it also depends on what you're recruiting against in types of majors. So, I mean, there are some other variables there.
Now,
Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and one we've kind of questioned as well as we navigate this with stakeholders is, what's the broader, how do we affect the broader question of how do we get the institutions themselves to diversify, to facilitate access for the EPPs? Because I do agree with you that your kind of pipeline is probably a little more narrow, being a small program. And so it may make it more difficult for you to attract those folks who may be only entering your university through specific programs.
Correct. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, and I think it's true in a lot of places, right? It's not just my institution, but I'm just the example. So, yeah, I think that, so I don't know if there's a way to do a range within or like a standard deviation kind of model or something. It's just something for you to think about in your statistical mind, Tom. Go for it. Okay.
Hey, Tom, this is James, if I may. So one is I appreciate, y'all performing these calculations for us, and I love that you all have focused on sort of rate of growth year over year. I'm in agreement that I think that with the idea that we should kind of keep it at more of an absolute rather than a relative measure, right, year after year, so that we're not trying to hit a moving target, or maybe we do both, but I think in terms of, for accountability purposes, that the absolute measure probably makes the most sense. Is there a reason why we chose like a 10-year chunk versus like a smaller denomination of years, like maybe 5 years? 10 years just seems like a long time. And the demographic shift in a given college university, I think, would vary a lot within a 10-year period. And so would a smaller number of years be possible as well?
So the years are just something we picked because Andrew can divide by 10. So,
That is correct.
so we could change those years however this group decides. And those changes would be easy to calculate for for line 74 and 76. That's not an issue. I think in my head, I just thought, we've got 2030 goals out there. Let's attach those to that. But if that's not the right metric, we can change it.
Okay, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it'd be my modest suggestion that, we consider lowering that threshold, right? I don't know if we want to do it like the cohort model, right? Or however we want to do it, but something more in the 4 to 6 year range, I think would just make a little more sense.
Sure.
Tom, this is Hank. As we're thinking about this and thinking about starting a benchmark, especially if we're going to go with a smaller frame of time, a 4 or 5 year growth rate projection, I wonder would it make sense at all to do an average of the past 5 years for each one of the universities to set as the benchmark? Because we know that there are often some outlier years where you'll bring in a bigger class, a smaller class, a more diverse class. There are lots of things that could happen from year to year. It might be a more fair representation to look at the last 5 years versus what would come in the next 5 years, so that there's some kind of we've still got time for growth, but we also take into account the fact that, our demographics can shift pretty dramatically from year to year based on what our recruiting class looks like.
Yeah, Hank, I think that's a great suggestion. We can certainly do that. It's just a matter of data collection. This 1 year is just what we were able to capture with consistency, but yes, we could certainly do that. I need to do a quick check with staff to make sure somebody's documenting these questions and.
They are.
Okay.
Yeah, I was
Yes,
doing
I
that
am.
with Kim behind the scenes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I'm doing that.
I knew the answer was yes, but I just wanted to make sure.
Hey, Tom, I think this is 2 points. As you were looking at this analysis, did you look at using completers, graduates of a program as the variable rather than the enrollment head count? Because for these reasons, one, ultimately what we want is more diversity of the teachers in the profession. And diversifying the preparation programs does not necessarily in and of itself diversify the number of graduates. Secondly, when you compare the teacher education population as a statistic at UNCW, for example, to the total population, you're really comparing people who have already gotten past particular academic benchmarks. These tend to be people with 50 plus credit hours. They're more like juniors and seniors. Comparing that subgroup against the entire undergraduate population at the institution might give a false threshold.
So let me make sure I'm understanding. So restrict the institution population to what we would consider upperclassmen to see, and because that's really the pool you're drawing from, not the freshmen and sophomores.
Correct. And take UNCW as an example. We could recruit a highly diverse population of first-time students that might not necessarily be indicative of the total student population, or in this particular case, more importantly, the people who graduate. Because ultimately what we want to know is, are we diversifying the profession through the people who complete the EPP programs. And I don't want to throw a whole, idea of reworking this entirely, but, as a dean, at the end of the day, are we graduating a more diverse population of people who go into the teaching profession is a different question than the head count of the enrollment. If that makes sense.
I don't disagree with that. And I think it's fine. It seems to me that it's a higher bar for EPPs, but if it's, so I want to kind of reframe the way we're talking about this. I feel like you guys are asking me if we could do, I want to make it clear that we serve you. So whatever policy recommendations you decide on as a subcommittee, we will support those in whatever way you need to. We're happy to, consult and answer questions and have some intellectual dialogue about this, but ultimately the choice is yours. And we'll let you know if that's just, if anything you're recommending is impractical from our data collection and analysis standpoint. But other than that, these policy recommendations are yours to make.
Hey, Tom, this is Anthony Graham. Thanks for putting all this together and sharing with us. I've got a question. I think I know the answer to it, but I want to ask anyway. Is the goal here to attain and sustain or to attain? And what I mean by that is if an EPP attains its target in, let's say, a 3-year window, and then for whatever reason, in years 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever the range may be, it doesn't hit that range or that target anymore. That EPP attained its target at one point, but didn't sustain it. So how do we treat that EPP, I guess?
So that's a great question. And the way I would think about that is, so attainment in itself is a great thing. And obviously, so let's just take ASU, and I don't mean to pick on them in any way. They're just the first one in the column. So let's say at the end of next year, ASU miraculously found those 29 extra candidates and they met the overall goal. So every year we would look at ASW, and they have to maintain an EPP total of 49 in their university in order to meet the standard for that year. So to answer your question, it's not just to attain, it's to attain and sustain.
Tom, I have a couple questions again. This is Ann, or a couple statements. I'd like for the committee to think about, we had talked about a threshold. I think Tennessee maybe does a threshold. So like if someone's already at X percentage diversity with diverse candidates, that they wouldn't feel the pressure to continue to grow to meet this for an EPP accountability model. I think we need to think about that because I think that puts undue pressure if you're doing really, really well. Maybe, again, we'll go with our gold star model. And then the second question or consideration I'd like for the committee to think about is, or something, Tom, I think y'all probably going to have to help us think through is, what if you're a non-traditional EPP? What is your comparison quota on that?
Right. This is Andrew. Let me jump in here. So there are a lot of things that we need to consider going forward. So one of the things you brought up is if you look at row 80 and below, those are questions that I think come up. Should this be a direction that we want to head towards? But I think a broader question for this group, it's really important to me as sort of the in-between these two thinking bodies with the board and the commission. When the initial proposal that went to the board was to look at the possibility of a domain 4 that would have a demographic component or a diversity component in it 2 years from now, and the pushback from the board was, can we get on that a little bit faster? And so another component of that is within that domain proposal was the idea of looking at at sort of setting a statewide expectation, not unlike what Tennessee did. Their statewide expectation was 22%. If you met or exceeded that 22%, then you've met the cut score. Another one would be to look at the individual within the institution. If you met or exceeded within the demographics of your institution, not unlike what we're looking here, then that would be fine. And a third was a growth component that was in the original proposal. So what I'd like to get from you all at some point is, you know, how are all these things sort of mulling around in your minds, and what do you think initially feels like a good idea or a horrible idea, so that we can get some of those things off the table. And then, Ann, I think what you're asking about, there are a lot of things that need to be worked out in this institution level model, beginning with very small institutions. If I have an institution that only produced one candidate over 3 years, what are the requirements for that institution? You know, what about EPPs, like what Ann was saying, that do not have an institution? They are a residency only model, and their population is the candidates. So what are the expectations for them? There are a lot of these little questions that we have to work out, but I think a broader question here is, I just want to make sure that the will of the board and the interests of the board are heard by the subcommittee, so that we are moving sort of towards the same goals, that everybody can feel good about the potential outcomes in this next go around.
Hey, Andrew, this is Hank again. So I know we're looking specifically at race, ethnicity in this table. I know that we had also discussed using Pell eligible first generation students, rural and urban, and some of those other demographics that could go in with this. Are we still thinking about that for this first go around? Because I think that would really change a lot of these numbers, or at least if we were looking at, I think at one time we were looking at, there might be 4 areas within this particular domain, and that you had to meet so many of them or show growth in so many of them. I don't know where we've landed on that, or if that's still a part of the discussion.
Right. So again, I think all of it is on the table. I do think, I mean, I can share with you right now the reason that I focused on this particular component is because we have data on this particular component. So when you start talking about some of the other measures that were included in the domain 4, and one of the reasons that we were hedging on being able to do anything for 2 years is because we don't have the data yet. And if you're looking at a component for Pell eligible and some of those other measures, we would have to collect that data, and then we would have to collect a second year's worth of data to look at growth over time. So this was just me trying to put together something based on what hard data and evidence we actually had across the institutions. So I'm not saying no to that, and I'm not saying yes to that. I think that's one of the things that this group has to think about in terms of what it would like to move forward on.
Yeah, hey, Andrew, like this here. Hank, I think that was part of, in our last subcommittee meeting, how this came up was the possible third way, where we have data like race and gender. We go ahead and implement that in the model now, and that maybe the pilot could focus on the subdomains where we don't have reliable data yet, and work to figure that out over the next 2 years.
This is Ann. I'd be comfortable with that if we're allowed to use that in our reporting mechanism to see how it works, right, in the pilot, like first gen, et cetera, et cetera.
What do you mean by that, Ann? Can you explain a little bit further?
So originally you would say, okay, Ann, you need, you know, let's just make up a number, 3 people next year, like 3 diverse candidates included in your account. And I could say, I have 3 candidates, but I have 1 candidate, but I also have in the pilot this first gen person that has been verified by admissions or whatever, and I have this person who's Pell eligible who's been verified by admission, or like that we can start working with our own EPPs to start figuring out how we're going to collect that data and report it as part of the pilot, which I think is what Andrew, my buddy Andrew over there was saying, my other buddy Andrew. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the spirit of it was just we don't want to let perfect be the enemy of progress right now. And given that we have racial and gender data, we could go ahead and start with that based on what the state board shared with us. And then we could pilot the other domains we were thinking about. But we need more time to get reliable data and to figure out how those might work.
This is JB, and I want to respond to Andrew, Dr. Seiberg's goal of having some board input here. And I'm not speaking for James or Olivia, I think also on the call. My hope with this is we create the incentives and an accountability model that drive what I think's in the institutional goals of our EPPs already. And so to the degree to which it facilitates, as an example, new partnerships with community college to potentially diversify enrollment. I think about Van Dempsey and the work the NCW all have done there. If it means you get to lean on your admissions offices and say, these are the kind of candidates we really need, and we hope that you're going to be focused on those priorities for us. If it means we can go with you to our legislative colleagues and talk about incentives that you need to make it work, a model that drives that kind of behavior rather than let's code another major as education and count kids somewhere else, even if they're not going to go into teaching, or the kind of things that can happen with accountability systems when they get to be more compliance oriented than the right incentives. So it feels to me like this conversation is moving in the right direction in terms of what the board has been talking about to address the significant gap between who's in our schools and who's teaching the kids. But I just wanted to put kind of those values or goals on the table.
Thank you.
I'd just like to thank Mr. Budson for saying that, because I had not really heard that clearly. Before this, so it's very good for me, this is Ann, to hear that and to know that is the purpose. And I think it's good for all the EPPs that are listening to also hear that, because it's still an accountability model. So to use it in the right ways, I think is really, really important. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's JB.
Okay.
Andrew, I'm going to take my Dean hat off and put on my Pepsi hat. I just did the math. If you go to row 74 and you count across, I think the total is 45. Roughly, call it 50. I don't know what the total head count is across all EPPs in the state. Is that in here somewhere?
No, but we can get that for you.
I just think it's a little bit to JB's point, and I think it's also to a point that transcends this particular analysis. If we look at in a given year increasing the total head count by 50, what is that doing ultimately to the entire population of EPP candidates across the state? You know, how much have we actually diversified? What's the impact of 50 on the diversity of the entire population? And then to the second point, the number who go into teaching. Ultimately, that is the critical factor. How many end up in the teaching profession? And so JB made a point about, incentives and things that have to be put in place to get us there. To go back to something that Andrew Lakis and I talked with our subcommittees about, even if we do this to the absolute best we can do it, we're going to need other things to get to where we need to be. The EPPs can only get us so far in the absence of some structural supports.
Yeah, thanks for that, Van. And I just would add, connecting that dot to what JB shared, you know, in my mind, a good accountability model prioritizes and incentivizes, you know, changes in behavior and resource allocation. And so, you know, some of that could be like legislative or incentive structures that were created with that. And some of it also, I think, could be the rethinking of this at the institutional level. And, you know, how presidents, chancellors, and all those folks are thinking about this as part of operating an EPP program.
Hey, you know, so if I may interject, this is James Ford again. So I really like the notion of wrapping these interventions in a larger sort of communications or advocacy strategy, right? Because, you know, on the one hand, EPPs have agency within their sphere of influence, but there needs to be the consistent and persistent recognition that there got to be a ton of policy and structural supports to maximize and amplify the impact, right? So, you know, we're not switching one thing out for the other, but I think continuing to press the conversation for greater structural reform should be part of the larger term strategy, right? So, I mean, all of this is wrapped up when we think about it in the narrative of, you know, I feel like student achievement and student outcomes ultimately, right? Teacher diversity being a major lever of that. Even if we get this 100% correct, there'll still be issues with student enrollment. There'll still be issues with student discipline, right, that have to be taken care of. There'll still be all sorts of other issues that break across lines of demographic, the disadvantaged, historically marginalized groups. This is one lever within an entire system, within an entire framework that we can have some impact on. But I think marrying those two consistently helps to create a more comprehensive picture for folks like ourselves, for folks at the General Assembly, et cetera, and even the general public. So I think that's a great idea.
And to that point, it's making me think about this question of like growth over time at the institutional level versus, or in addition to a kind of universal threshold like Tennessee has, 22%. Making me think, like, as a state, where do we want to be in 10 years, and what's a realistic yet ambitious overall percentage that we would like to see, that if an institution's already meeting that threshold, then they wouldn't need to improve over time, they would just need to maintain that. But for, you know, institutions that are below that threshold, they would be working to improve that over time so that we hit the collective goal of where we want to be as a state in 10 years.
And I think all that's fair. This is Hank again, and I'm totally on board, and I love the idea of a larger structural policy change from lots of different levels. I know that's what it'll take. Our sphere of influence, even at our own institutions in terms of enrollment, I think is limited at best. We can certainly push things, but if our presidents, provosts, admissions, vice presidents aren't on board with that and don't know that that should be a goal for them as well, then it's likely not to happen, especially in a time where we're all fighting for enrollment period and trying to make sure that we get enough enrollment to support, you know, what we have to do at our institutions. So I think that's a good one. It's the one part that I guess still kind of scares me a little bit about this particular thing when it comes to sanctions. So if I'm a UNC Chapel Hill and I've got to grow 85 over the next 5 years, possibly, that could be 16 new diverse students per year over that 5 years. It's going to be a tough one to do. Not that it's impossible and not that we shouldn't be going forward that, but to think that we would sanction them because of that, not meeting that goal, that scares me a little bit. It's almost like the antithesis of what we're trying to do. We're gonna punish you when you're trying your hardest to do what you can, unless there are lots of structural and policy procedural, some incentives in place to help us do that. I think that it becomes unfair for some of these, while there's other places like my institution that needs to grow 0, right, per year over the next 10 years, which I found a little bit interesting, but I want to make sure it's a fair process and not one that hurts an institution that's trying to do their best given the situation that we're in.
Yeah, and Andrew, just as a, or maybe Tom as a analytics part in that, back to that row 74, when you look at the effect of the analysis, you get a lot of 0, 1, 2s, and then you get 7, 8s. And so is there some dynamic that you get this sort of bimodal distribution? And you take like UNCW, our number we need to grow per year is 1. And then you compare us to what says Chapel Hill 8.
Without getting in the weeds here, I mean, remember that the calculation is really the institution compared to the EPP demographics, not EPP to EPP. So, you know, they in some cases would be potentially a lot different depending on how the EPP reflects the institution demographics.
Okay.
And that maybe that's not something the direction you want to go, but that's, I mean, when we're looking at this calculation, that's what we're doing.
Yeah, I'm just in term, just very quickly glance at it. It just seems like a bimodal distribution, and you get a lot of 0, 1s, and then you have 7 and 8s. And what happened to the 3, 4, 5s? I mean, that just the nature of the beast, and that's how it worked out. Just making sure there's not something we missed in structurally how this fell out, because it could end up unintentionally putting pressure on the institutions that have already made significant progress to make a whole lot more progress.
So Dr. Dempsey, this is Tom, and I think you're uncovering an inherent problem in this method, is that really, if you think about it, EPPs situated in institutions of higher education that are less diverse would have a lower threshold to meet than an EPP situated in a more diverse institution. And
Right.
so it's perfectly reasonable to think of ways that could be mitigated. But the prevailing idea here was that we wanted an accountability model that was achievable given the context of each EPP. So I don't know how we would necessarily do that. So UNC Asheville is a really interesting case. It's unclear to me whether their requirement is low because Andrew, I think if you can scroll up on that, we can look at that and see, is this because they are reflecting the institution well, or is it because the institution itself is relatively non-diverse?
Yeah, maybe something we can come back and talk about some more. And I'm gonna use my own institution as the example. UNCW, which has a reputation for being more than most disproportionately white. If I'm scrolling back across, we would have an expectation of growing by 1 candidate a year. And I don't say that as if it wouldn't be a lift for UNCW, because it is. We are a white institution. What the effect of that is, as compared to, scrolling back across, UNC Chapel Hill, East Carolina, others that are in the 7 days. I just think if we as we're continuing to have this analysis, we come back and understand what the effects of that are, and are we doing what we intend to do? I'm not criticizing the strategy. I'm just putting some questions out there for later analysis.
No, I think it's a very important point.
It feels like the other thing we ought to maybe look at, and maybe this is built in there, is how many completers each year, diverse completers, is each institution actually producing? And is that growing over time? I know we talked about, more than one way to look at this, and perhaps that's a way to help for schools that are producing, probably our largest numbers of diverse candidates, but maybe it's not reflected when we compare it to their institution.
So, Tom, if I may, yeah, I think that's a measure I'd be interested in looking at as well. Sort of wearing the state board hat here. I think about the ways in which we analyze AP data. We don't just look at enrollment. That's one of the things we look at. We look at, in addition to that, test takers, and then those who get a 3 or above, right? Because I feel like each of those answer different questions, but they're equally important. And so, kind of a comprehensive look at those things is one that I think is in order for us to really get to what we're really trying to figure out, which is how to, diversify the field writ large. But if we look at this as a pipeline, there are several stops, several stations, where change can be effective. And if I may, kind of going back to the idea about unintended consequences and sanctions, I think JP did I know he didn't presume to speak for myself or Dr. Oxendine, but I think it's the sentiment of the board. The notion of punishment or punitive approaches in order to incentivize is not. I don't think that that's the spirit of this legislation to begin with. Certainly not our approach. It's to create an environment that does, create a sense of urgency. I think the fear of being unduly punished for lack of diversity is real, but I also don't want it to be read, particularly for those who, I'll say like myself, who are always trying to find ways to enact equity. When we look at the 3 other categories that are associated with this accountability model as well, some of those would place EPPs in a position where coming out the chute, they may also be in undesirable positions or also may be subject to sanction. And so the focus on this particular component, diversity, as the one where, it could have the most unintended consequence. I just don't want that to be read like, from an outsider perspective. Are we concerned about sanctions in general or just sanctions in association with diversity? And so I feel like I need to throw that out there to get some clarity. Is the concern, generally speaking, about sanctions and associated with this model, or is it the sanctions associated with the diversity component that gives everybody the most heartburn?
I think I appreciate that, James. I think what we are feeling is that we have a lot of control over other aspects like EdTPA or PPAT scores, possibly the survey data, hopefully the performance of our candidates once they enter into the field. What we have the least amount of control over, it feels like to us, just because admissions happens outside of our particular realm of influence most of the time, is that this one's going to be the hardest one for us to impact. Not that we don't want to, and not that we won't do everything possible to make it happen. It's just the ones that we have our hands tied the most on in terms of making real structural changes within our institutions or our EPPs or with our students to make these changes.
This is Ann. I feel like I also need to answer this because I have been the one that's spoken out against this, because when I go to any EPP meeting, talk to any EPP, the things that they talk about are all the things they're doing to try to recruit teachers, how difficult it is with the current climate, et cetera, that we all know, and how funding isn't, there's not a lot of funding to help support, put teachers in the classroom, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this in particular, based on what Hank just said and based on other factors of feeling like you're, quote, going to get beat up, unquote, if you don't meet this and get sanctioned, is a real concern of EPPs far and wide, particularly around this when they are trying very hard.
Yeah, so, go ahead.
Go ahead. I just was gonna, oh, sorry. I just wanted to add one caveat here, that it is the strong recommendation of the EPP Accountability Subcommittee that this is why the law as it's currently written is problematic, and that if you look at the Tennessee model, like a weighted aggregate score that drives the overall score drives the sanctions, it's critically important, because if not, on any of these measures, whether we add diversity or not, you could be doing really well in 3 of them, fall short in 1, and all of a sudden you found yourself in a sanction situation, which I don't think is a strong policy framework for any of this accountability model. So beyond just what we're talking about today with the diversity component, I just can't state enough how important it is that we make this an aggregate model and not the way it's currently written into law.
This is Tom. Andrew Lakis, thank you for that. That was exactly what I was going to say, is that that is at the heart of the proposal we're hoping to put forward to the legislature, is that the aggregate model is the sanctionable measure. The domains within that overall measure is formative for the EPPs to get feedback on, to get data on, so that they can plot program improvement and make sure that they're addressing those situations without fear of going into sanction. And so the other piece of that, this is really important, is that we are proposing a weighted model. So part of the work would be to how do we understand this fitting into the context of what we need for our teachers in North Carolina. Where does this diversity measure sit in relation to high quality preparation and teacher performance once they enter the field? What are those relationships and what are our values? And that should be reflected in the weighting model.
And if I may, so Tom, one of the things I love about what you and Dr. Seiberg have worked on here is that, sort of speaking to some of the earlier fears from EPPs that were pronounced a moment ago, is that it does take into account the nuance of, the character of each institution writ large, so that it's not a comparison of one institution to another, one EPP to another, but kind of holding an EPP accountable for its particular context and its social location. I think what I hear everybody expressing is, how do you create accountability without necessarily sanctioning or punishing anybody? And that obviously is something that remains to be seen, is something we're still ironing out. And so but the goal of the pursuit of creating a sense of urgency around this seems to be something that there's universal agreement on. And so as far as that goes, I think this is although it's not perfect yet, and I don't think you were presented as such, I feel like what we have before us is close to becoming what I think is a digestible, usable approach to measuring diversity in a way that still incentivizes.
I think that's helpful, Mr. Ford. This is Andrew. I think, again, the purpose of this meeting is less about the minutia of all the little if-thens that go on. I think that's going to be work that this subcommittee is going to have to iron out, like we've mentioned earlier, some of the questions that Ann brought up. But it sounds like, at least from your perspective and from some of the input we heard from Mr. Buxton, that thinking about it this way is not, that this is a productive way of thinking about it. And this may be a way to incorporate it in initially and then add some of the other measures as they come online and we collect that data over time, which was one of the urgencies that you had mentioned in the board meeting was, can we get something off the ground a little quicker than 2 years from now? So I think that's, as far as what I've heard so far, I think that's very helpful to this team and to moving the work forward.
Absolutely, and thanks for that.
Andrew, Syberg, based on where we are with this conversation, would you see this now going back to the two subcommittees? We'd have a joint meeting and look at this, what would be the next step for Pepsi?
Right, that's a good question. So I think, the purpose of this meeting was to get some input from the board and to get some alignment from the board. And then, to go back into the subcommittee work and work out all the little details, and try and shape this into what we think is a healthy way of looking at it. And then do another pass back with these folks from the board, sort of see if that's looking like it's heading in the right direction when it gets a little tighter, and then ultimately get it in front of the full commission for a recommendation vote to go to the board later on. So yeah, I think the details still need to be worked out. There are a lot of details, guys. Like, and I'm talking to the Pepsi subcommittees right now. What makes sense for these very tiny institutions? What makes sense for sanctions? But what's the correct touch point there? But I think what hopefully everybody is seeing here is that we have another way of looking at this data. And it's a contextualized lens that I think is something that the subcommittees hadn't seen yet to this point. And this is something that I think is a good and healthy way of taking another shot at this.
So this is Tom Tomberlin. Oh, go ahead, Ann. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I just thought of one more thing that maybe I just want to write down in the question category. Is what if you're like a Duke and you have an MAT program, and I think that Duke has they pay for all their tuition for those students to go, or most of it, and they have a cap on who they can put in because it's endowed. So I think we need to think about like an MAT program that maybe that's all you have, and they also have some undergraduates, but is there a situation where someone might get penalized in this model because they do have a cap on their program? I think we can find that out, but that is something I thought up during this conversation.
Yeah, that's another one we should add to the little list. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
So this is Tom. I want to make sure that we capture Dr. Dempsey's point about the overall impact on the state. I think it would be helpful for the subcommittee, ultimately for the full body of Pepsi and the state board, if we did a little white paper on if we achieved these goals in whatever time frame, we can do 5-year, 10-year, what would that look like in terms of the teacher diversity in relation to our student population diversity? I think it's a very important thing to raise, to see what we're really talking about with the net effect of this action would be. And are those estimates, are they acceptable to everybody? And I'm happy to hear from others if you don't think that would be helpful.
I think that could be helpful. I think as long as it doesn't skew our work, I think it's helpful in terms of what's reasonable. I also think if we need to start calculating and documenting what specific recruitment strategies and what barriers we're hearing that are also coming up for the wraparound.
This is Andrew Lakis. I have a question for our state board colleagues joining us today. I mean, do you all have either a goal in mind around this, or have you thought about goals or targets? I think the latest data I saw was that our educator workforce in public schools is currently 18% people who identify as people of color. Like, do y'all have anything on this, or is this something that's still in development?
Hey, this is James. So, in terms of a target goal or a metric that's associated with our goals and objectives, we just communicated in our strategic plan that we want to increase educator diversity, but we're still developing some of our targets as part of our strategic planning work. So as of yet, those things have not been identified, but they absolutely are in progress.
Thanks for that, James. Yeah, it just makes me think there could be a powerful synchronization point there as we think about kind of, a universal threshold percentage like Tennessee has.
Hey, Tom, your proposal about the white paper, I like the idea. I think if we can get our heads around what an outline of that might look like, going, down the road. But I do think that kind of framing is important.
I just wanted to chime in. I've got a couple texts from Dr. Oxendine. She's listening intently, but not able to chime in. And so what I'm going to do is after this meeting, I'll connect with her and make sure that we capture her ideas and thoughts as well and incorporate them into the notes for everybody.
Andrew, could we get a general pulse from her on whether this feels right or wrong, just globally? I want to make sure that we don't get off this call without having some sense of whether she thinks this is problematic.
I know she heard that, and I'm sure she's going to text me here in a second. She's texted so far. It's killing me that she can't join, and
I'm sure.
I'm sure she's typing furiously right now. So I'll chime back in when I hear back from her to your question. She has a few points. Hold on. She's going to share them here shortly. Well, actually, I'll wait. I'll let her take a minute to type them in, and that'll give some other folks an opportunity to chime in right now. So I'll come back here in a minute.
Well, I don't, Andrew and I could stay on the line, and maybe Pepsi subcommittee members can stay on the line so we're hearing Dr. Oxendine's thoughts on these issues. But I know that board members have a pretty big 2:30 meeting today that they might need to prepare for. So, Mr. Ford or Mr. Buxton, is there anything else that any other wisdom you'd like to impart to this team before?
No wisdom from me, just a thanks for the engagement, the level of thinking on this and the clear commitment to it. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know if I have any wisdom to offer, but I'm appreciative of being invited and to be able to chime in, and thankful for the work y'all have done this far. Feel free to reach out to us for anything else. Okay.
Great, thanks to you both.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
we
you.
thank you guys for sharing. And Dr. Oxendine did just say that she's going to put her ideas into writing and get them over to us. So we'll make sure that we get them out to everybody that was on this call. It's a matter of making sure everybody has some transparency.
Great.
And so the people that are on the subcommittee, I think I have two thoughts here. One is, we've learned a lot here. We've given the subcommittee some new things to look at and to think about. And we've heard some feedback from board members, which I think is very helpful. I think it would be prudent for all of you to think very carefully about some of the questions that are at the bottom of this document and some of the questions that have been shared today. Tim will get an email out to all of you that will ask for an opportune time to meet as a subcommittee in the coming days. Obviously, it'll be virtual, but you'll also send out the key questions that were brought up and key points that were brought up in this meeting. It'll take her a little bit of time to outline all that. So if you all can be very thoughtful in how this might shape altering your existing thinking around Domain 4 and where some of the challenges are. If you run into any, I do this all the time and then I never write it down. So if you run into stuff and you're like, man, I don't have an answer to that, and then I sort of stop thinking about it, write those things down, because those are things that other folks within the team could probably share some brain power on and might be able to mitigate. So so that would be my suggestion going forward, is to look and be prepared to really start to unpack and think about how to rebuild a Domain 4 for the way to
Hey, Andrew, I got an email during this that UNC Charlotte and UNC
Yes,
Chapel
yep,
Hill
yep.
data is inverted.
They're flipped. Yeah, I got to fix that, and I'll zap out
Okay.
a new. I'll zap out a V9. I saw that. That came from Laura Hart. She and I have been emailing or texting.
Okay.
So yeah, noted.
Got it.
Hey.
Thank you.
Andrew, and both Andrews, do we want to try to have a joint subcommittee meeting to do this, or that would just make one meeting unnecessary? We wouldn't have to do the first subcommittee, then the second.
I would yield to your you guys as the leads of the subcommittees how you want to deal with that.
Yeah, I mean, Van, Dr. Dempsey, it's been good having at least you with us when we can, so that there's just a continued kind of flow of connectivity between the sanctions and the accountability framework. I'd be open to everyone convening. I'd also be okay if you joined us as kind of the representative.
Yeah, I'm going to definitely plan to be there. I appreciate that, and Van is fine. I appreciate that. And we, are we under any kind of, Andrew Seiberg, are we under any kind of
We have
calendar?
10 more minutes. We have 10 more minutes. Oh, on the meeting, I'm sorry.
No, I mean,
Dr. Dempsey.
do we have to get something back to the state board?
We submitted in time what the Pepsi submitted in time what it wanted to recommend, and that was sent back to you all. And now my assumption now is that it's in your hands to get it done and get it done correctly. The last thing we want to do is rush and do it incorrectly and hand something over that's not thought through very carefully. But I would say that we don't want to put it off for many more months.
Okay, well, then let's go ahead, Andrew Lakis, and convene your subcommittee, because Zoom does have its limits and a smaller group is easier to have a conversation.
Works for me.
So for the subcommittee meetings, we are using GoToMeeting and GoToWebinar. So for GoToWebinar, you can have up to 1,000 people. We don't use Zoom.
Oh, yeah, whatever the tool is, but we can, it's the nature, it's having the conversation with everyone attending virtually. And I'm okay either way. But particularly since we don't have a time pressure on the calendar.
yeah, I would suggest we go ahead and schedule the accountability subcommittee meeting, and Van, you join us.
Okay, I'll do that. That works.
Great. All right. Well, any other thoughts about next steps, or does everybody seem to be okay with that, with what I've framed as next steps?
Yes. I have a question about what you're going to present this afternoon.
What am I presenting this afternoon?
Sure.
State
and-
board?
Go ahead.
Oh, that's a Tom
I have
question,
a
not an
que-
Andrew thing. Okay.
Oh, Tom, go ahead. I don't understand the part about what y'all are presenting where it says something about student, EPPs may have a problem with the student teaching piece. What exactly y'all are presenting as a resolution for the student teaching semester?
I think the resolution is to allow the recommendation that the preferred recommendation is that we allow you to recommend them as you see fit.
Okay, all right.
And that would probably necessitate legislative action.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Van has the word that,
Two
particular
words,
word.
as practicable. I love that phrase.
Now
Next time a faculty member asks me about a pay raise, I'm going to say as practicable.
So, Van, just to be clear, that is related to the field experiences, correct?
Internship.
Student teaching
So-
internship.
I thought that was the field experiences in 599.
Yeah, we raised that in the law. The field experiences where they have to have so many hours of field experiences per.
Yeah, and the low performing.
I got it right here.
Yeah, and the low performing, that is as practicable, to the extent practicable.
Is it?
Right here.
Oh, it's
That-
down in the clinical practice.
No, I mean
Both?
no, I mean the legislation that's going to give the EPPs the flexibility
I got
Because-
you,
because of
I got-
Corona.
Oh, okay.
because we're not
Now it's already in
recommending,
play. Got it.
we're not recommending anything on field experience because it says in the law, where it's
Right.
practical. So we
Right.
said, that's an easy one.
Yeah, that's in Florence, that's what the Senate committee plucked out for the internship and said it was, whatever number of weeks or as practicable as determined by the dean.
Yep, that'll be great.
I love that phrase.
It's
Van, I knew
handy.
you wanted an opportunity to say it, so I
As
like
practicable.
you said it the other day, as practicable.
As practicable.
Yeah, I'm
And
looking
that
at
also
the,
allows us to use our online pieces, right? Things they're doing online with their teachers.
I'm looking at at 599. I don't know if my screen is still available, but it does say it looks to me like, and Tom, weigh in on this. It looks like the internship lasts for 16 weeks. That's not to the extent is practicable. To the extent practicable is whether it happens at the beginning or the end of the school year.
Well, what Van is saying, I'm saying, Dr. Dempsey is saying is that the proposed legislative fix is to include the phrase "to the extent practicable" in front of the internship.
Yes.
Okay.
Van, by the way, Tom.
Okay, I don't want to be disrespectful.
No, that's fine, Dr. Tomlin. No, Van's good.
Hey, Van, didn't you
Yes,
say
Doc-
that's what they
yes,
did?
Dr.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Dempsey. Did you say that is what they did during the hurricane? Isn't that what you said?
Yes, they use that phrase.
Yeah, yeah. Just if y'all need some, background, other
Got it.
language.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, by the way, before we jump off, I think this came a phenomenally long way. I really applaud your thinking and pulling this together like you did.
Well, that was all Tom's thinking. I did the grunt work, but he was doing the thinking behind it.
You all know Andrew Cyberg is a horrible liar, so, you know.
Plus, it's a long flight to Tahiti, so you can get a lot of work done on those. That'll be in the News and Observer tomorrow. DPI official has home in Tahiti.
That's right. Is it appropriate to do your work in Tahiti for North Carolina?
Absolutely.
You work wherever you want to these days, Andrew.
Social distancing at its best.
Oh, I'm distant, all right.
As long as you have internet.
All right, very good. Well, everybody stay tuned from notes and some dates and times for a hookup for the next meeting from Kim. And we'll also get that information from Dr. Oxendine as soon as it gets into us. We'll send that out separately. I will make that one adjustment that Dr. Hart found in the document, and we'll continue to tighten that up. That was a couple days worth of work, and it may have another snafu or two in there, but the general thinking is what you were looking at today. So.
Right. Thank you. Thank
Sounds
you
good.
all.
Thanks,
All
everybody.
right, everybody. Have a great day.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Kim, can you stay
Bye,
on for a
Kim.
second?
Yes.
So do I need to convert this?
Wait. Hey, Lawrence, can you stop the live streaming, please?
I feel like at some point you in the past you've told me to convert it so that it turns it into an audible document for you. Don't I do that in here somewhere?
Well, I can end the meeting and then I can just deal with the live streaming.
Okay. All right. So
Okay.
if you were saying earlier, don't leave the meeting like somehow it was attached to me.
What?
You said in our earlier chat when we were chatting behind the
No,
scenes, you
I'm
were
just saying that we need to end the meeting on time. That's all.
Oh, right. Okay.
All right, do you guys?
Very good.
I'm out.
Wait a minute, Tom. Don't you want to
Yeah.
have another hour-long meeting before you have another 2-hour meeting?
Hey, Lawrence.
Please. All right, bye, y'all.
All right.
Bye.
We'll see you. Hello.
Hey, Lawrence. Hey,
Tom,
can you please stop the live streaming? Thank you. Thank you for all your help, Lawrence.